The Triple Entente was an alliance between Russia, Great Britain, and France. It was born out of a fear of a great war enveloping most of Europe. Pogroms were organized anti-Semitic violence in Russia before the Revolution. Although serfdom was outlawed in Russia in 1861, the treatment of peasants and workers in Russia continued to be very similar to serfdom. An autocratic government is a government in which one person holds all the power and controls the government. One example of an autocratic leader was Tsar Nicholas II, the leader of Russia before the Revolution. He was a weak leader who made too little changes too late. One such example of a change he made was the Duma, a legislative assembly made by elected officials. He created this in 1905, but by 1907 he had already curtailed its power and it was much weaker than it was intended to be. On March 8th, a day known since 1910 as International Women's Day, women in Russia marched through the streets of Petrograd demanding peace and bread. When Nicholas II heard of this, he thought it a hooligan movement and demanded that the soldiers gun the women down. However, as more and more soldiers joined the movement, he got more and more concerned. A week later, on March 15th, the Duma, which the Tsar had tried to disband, met without his approval and formed a provisional government led by Alexander Kerensky. On the same day, March 15th, the Tsar abdicated. The provisional government met a lot of resistance from the Soviets and was later overthrown in November of the same year. Grigory Rasputin was a Russian peasant who Tsarina Alexandra, the wife of Tsar Nicholas II, believed was the only one who could cure her hemophiliac son. This gained him power and he used to control the Russian government behind the scenes. Conservative aristocrats were unhappy with the way that Rasputin was running the Russian government, so they later assassinated him in December of 1916.
You are dead now. No, stop being alive.
As food became harder to obtain, people began to go on strike. Government troops foolishly shot into one of these peaceful demonstrations, killing hundreds, and the day later became known as Bloody Sunday. The angered protesters began to burn down houses and keep going on strike, which led to the government capitulating on October 5th. After Russia's defeat in the Crimean War, they began to expand into Asia. Japan angrily released a surprise attack on Port Arthur in 1904. After the March Revolution of 1917 and the abdication of the Tsar, Vladimir Lenin, with the help of Leon Trotsky, overthrew the provisional government, which became known as the November Revolution of 1917. The Russian Civil War, a battle between the Red, new communist regime, and the Whites, which was everyone else, resulted in a victory for the Reds because the Whites were unable to unify or agree on policies, while the Reds were able to unify under the communist regime and take power. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's right-hand man and leader of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, demanded complete loyalty from his soldiers.
After the fall of the Tsarist regime, the provisional government faced another problem, mainly from the Soviets. The Soviets were communes of workers and soldiers that arose to support their mainly socialist ideologies. Vladimir Lenin was a Russian socialist who definitely worked to go against the Tsar. He was shipped off to Siberia for his revolutionary attempts, but he came back multiple times, until finally starting the Russian Revolution that brought Russia into its communist state of today.
Under the revolution, under our communist rule.
Lenin became a leader of the Bolsheviks, and after the Tsar was overthrown and the provisional government was instated in Russia, Lenin used the Bolshevik Party to help overthrow the provisional government. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was Lenin's way of getting the Soviet Union out of World War I because he knew he needed to concentrate his military force into fighting the Russian Civil War. War communism was put in place to nationalize industries and to forcibly remove grain from the peasants into putting it into the Civil War effort. Revolutionary terror was used to enforce the new communist policies, and one form of this revolutionary terror was the Cheka, used by leaders of the new communist government to assassinate or to kidnap political opponents and enemies that they called to the revolution. Lenin instated a communist government and was the leader of the Soviet Union until his death in 1924. After the Russian Revolution, all levels of industry were much lower than they were before the war. And in order to cope with this, Lenin implemented the new economic policy, the NEP, which retreated some of the communist goals of the government back into more capitalist ones, such as it allowed peasants to be able to sell their grain. And this drastically improved the economy of Russia, but still their industries were not at the levels they were before the revolution.